What do you do when the ocean itself turns into a weapon and you never even see it coming? Somewhere off the coast of a nation that thought its missiles made it untouchable, and that question is about to get answered in the worst way possible. Before we go further, if military stories that read like real history instead of recycled clickbait are your thing, hit subscribe, tap that like button, and send this to one friend who still thinks air defense means safety. You're going to want them in this conversation with you. It is just before sunrise over open water. The sea is flat and dark, the kind of calm that feels almost staged, like the world is holding its breath before something happens. A gray steel hull moves through that stillness without lights, without noise, without any hint that in a few minutes it is going to change the balance of power in an entire region. For weeks, this stretch of water had turned into a shooting gallery. Small boats speeding out from hidden coves, drones buzzing low over merchant ships, missiles launched from mobile trucks tucked into valleys, fired and gone before anyone could respond. It felt, to the men giving the orders on the other side, like they had found a loophole in modern warfare. Hit hard, hit fast, disappear before the reply arrives. That illusion was about to be shattered. Because while those men were celebrating their hit and run success, quiet men in war rooms thousands of miles away were doing something far less dramatic and far more dangerous. They were drawing lines on a map. They were measuring distances down to the meter. They were studying, patiently, exactly how a fleet already sitting nearby could turn a night of relative safety into the last calm night for a long time. This is the story of what happens when a Navy that has spent decades studying failure decides it will not fail this time. It is the story of a mismatch nobody saw coming. Not because the weapons were secret, but because almost nobody had bothered to imagine how those weapons would actually be used together. Let's rewind a little. Because to understand what happened in those first violent minutes, you need to understand the years that built up to them. For a long time, Iran built its entire strategy on a simple bet. Distance and geography would protect it. Its coastline curls around one of the most important shipping lanes on the planet, a narrow stretch of water where a huge share of the world's oil moves every single day. Iran filled the hills and valleys along that coast with mobile missile launchers, small fast attack boats, and drone squadrons. The thinking was straightforward. If you cannot be found quickly, you cannot be hit quickly. If your missiles can reach out over the water faster than anyone can react, you control the tempo of any fight that starts. For years, that bet looked reasonable. Ships passing through stayed nervous. Commanders stayed cautious. Nobody wanted to be the one who triggered a wider war over a single incident. Iran used that hesitation as cover, testing limits again and again, launching strikes and then retreating into ambiguity, daring anyone to prove exactly who fired what and when. Think about how patient that strategy actually was. It was not built around one dramatic act. It was built around dozens of small ones, spread out over months. Each one small enough on its own to avoid triggering a full-scale response, but adding up over time into something much bigger. A drone here, a missile there, a fast boat cutting too close to a tanker somewhere else. Each incident, taken alone, looked survivable. Together, they formed a pattern designed to test exactly how far provocation could go before someone finally decided enough was enough. And for a long stretch of time, it worked. Every government facing this kind of pressure has to weigh a strike against the risk of a wider war, against the price of oil, against alliances and treaties and public opinion back home. That hesitation is not weakness. It is caution. And caution is usually the right instinct in international affairs. But caution has a cost too, and the cost is that it teaches the other side exactly how much room they have to keep pushing. But hesitation has a shelf life. And on this particular morning, that shelf life ran out. What Iran had not accounted for was a quiet revolution taking place inside the American military, one that had almost nothing to do with bigger bombs or louder explosions and everything to do with timing. The United States had spent years studying its own failures in past conflicts, moments when smart missiles arrived at the wrong second or arrived one at a time, giving defenders exactly what they needed most, a chance to reset, reload, and try again. The fix for that problem does not sound impressive on paper. It is not a superweapon. It is choreography. It is the simple, brutal idea that if you are going to attack, every warhead should land inside the same few seconds. Not one missile followed by another, giving the enemy time to breathe between each threat, but a wall of destruction arriving all at once, so that whoever is trying to stop it only gets one chance to make an impossible decision. That idea sounds simple when you say it out loud. Making it actually work is one of the hardest problems in modern warfare, and on this morning, the American fleet in the region was about to prove it had solved it. To understand why this is so hard, imagine trying to get a dozen different runners, each starting from a different spot, each running a slightly different distance, to cross the same finish line at exactly the same second. Now imagine each runner is also allowed to change direction mid-race, speeding up or slowing down as they go. Coordinating that on paper is difficult. Coordinating it in real combat, under time pressure, with machines instead of people, using different launch points on a ship that itself is moving through open water, is close to the edge of what modern engineering can pull off. The fact that it worked on this particular morning was not an accident. It was the payoff of years of testing, refining, and rehearsing a tactic that most people outside a handful of military planning rooms never even hear about. At almost the exact same moment along the coastline, a battery of Iranian defenders came alive. Their equipment was not junk. These were legitimate modern systems, capable of shooting down aircraft and even some ballistic threats. The crews were trained and alert. In an earlier era, that alertness might have been enough. It was not enough this time, and the reason why says everything about how warfare has quietly changed shape in the last few years. The missiles rising off the deck that morning were not old-fashioned rockets falling in a lazy, predictable arc. They flew low, adjusted their path as they went, and refused to behave the way defenders expected a falling object to behave. Instead of one gentle curve up and down, each missile fought gravity the entire way, correcting itself. Again and again, right up until the final seconds before impact. Picture trying to catch a ball thrown by someone who keeps changing their throwing arm mid-air. That is roughly the problem facing anyone trying to shoot one of these things down. And that was only half the trick. The other half was timing. Every missile in that salvo launched a few seconds apart, on slightly different paths, at slightly different angles, all calculated so that despite leaving at different moments, they would all converge on their target within the same narrow window of time. Think of it like a dozen people leaving different train stations at different times, on different lines, all somehow arriving at the same platform within the same 10 seconds. That is not luck. That takes serious planning, serious computing power, and serious trust that your own machines will do exactly what you tell them. For the defenders on the ground, this created a nightmare. A radar system built to spot one threat and calmly track it now had over a dozen threats appearing at once, all behaving unpredictably, all arriving in the same heartbeat. Even with skilled operators and functioning equipment, there simply was not enough time to pick targets, lock on, fire, and reload before the entire wave had already passed overhead. There's another piece of this puzzle that mattered just as much as the missiles themselves, and it has nothing to do with weapons technology at all. It has to do with who gets to say yes. In many modern militaries, and Iran's is no exception, a soldier standing at a radar screen cannot simply decide on his own to fire an expensive interceptor missile. He has to report what he sees up the chain of command. Someone above him has to confirm the threat is real. Someone above that person often has to approve the response. Each one of those steps takes time, sometimes just a few seconds, sometimes much longer, especially if communication lines are stretched or confused in the chaos of an actual attack. On the American side, that human bottleneck had already been solved days, even weeks, before this operation began. The hardest decision, the moral and political decision to actually launch an attack, had already been made in a planning room far from the battlefield. Once that decision was made, everything downstream became automatic. Sensors talked to computers, computers talked to launch systems. There was no waiting for a colonel to pick up a phone and ask a general for permission in the middle of the fight. This is the part that rarely gets discussed when people talk about military power, but it might be the single most important factor in the entire story. People imagine that wars are won by whoever has the biggest missile or the thickest armor. In reality, a huge share of modern conflict is decided by something far less glamorous, who can turn a decision into an action fastest. An army with slightly weaker weapons but a faster decision cycle can consistently beat an army with slightly stronger weapons but a slower one, because speed compounds. Every extra second spent waiting for approval is a second the other side uses to close. Distance, to adjust its aim to finish what it started. Bureaucracy, in other words, can be just as dangerous to a fighting force as a badly designed weapon. That difference, more than any single piece of hardware, decided what happened next. While defenders were still relaying reports up their chain of command, while officers were still confirming what their radar screens were showing them, the missiles were already crossing into the thin upper atmosphere, invisible to heat sensors, invisible to most tracking systems, riding on pure momentum and mathematics alone. If you're starting to see how much of modern war comes down to seconds and decision-making instead of just raw firepower, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Hit that subscribe button now, because we're only halfway through, and what comes next explains exactly why the outcome of this fight was decided long before the first missile ever left its launcher. Down along the coast, one defense crew finally got its answer. Their launchers could climb high, but not high enough. There is a ceiling built into every interceptor system, an altitude above which its engines and guidance simply cannot follow a target. The incoming missiles spent a significant part of their flight cruising well above that ceiling, completely untouchable, no matter how good the crew below happened to be. By the time those incoming warheads finally dropped low enough to be within reach, the defenders had only a narrow slice of time to actually shoot, not minutes, seconds. And even during that narrow window, their systems could only track and engage a handful of targets at once, while more than a dozen were closing in from different angles and different altitudes. The commander in charge that morning did the math almost instantly. He had a limited number of interceptors. He was facing far more incoming threats than he had shots available. Even in a perfect scenario where every single interceptor worked exactly as designed and hit exactly what it was aimed at, there simply were not enough missiles on his launchers to stop everything heading his way. He fired anyway. That is not incompetence. That is exactly what a disciplined professional does when the math is against him. You do not surrender before the fight starts. You use what you have, and you hope the mathematics are wrong just this once. The mathematics were not wrong. Interceptor after interceptor left the rails, chasing targets that kept adjusting their path at the last possible second, sliding just out of reach of detonations that were aimed at where the target used to be a fraction of a second earlier. Explosions bloomed in the high, thin air, spectacular, but empty, hitting nothing but sky. Meanwhile, the wave kept descending, steady and unbothered, toward a target that had, until that morning, considered itself safely tucked away from any kind of direct strike. That target was not just a random patch of desert. It was a military installation used to plan and launch many of the very attacks that had made this stretch of ocean so dangerous in the first place. And here is where the story becomes less about explosions and more about human beings. The people inside that compound had no warning. Sound cannot outrun a missile moving at several times the speed of sound itself. That means for anyone standing on the ground below, the missile arrives before the sound of its own approach does. The first thing anyone would have experienced was not a roar in the sky. It was simply impact. Silence, then sudden, overwhelming violence, with no space in between for fear or preparation. In practical terms, there was no siren, no scramble, no last-minute dash toward shelter. Just an ordinary early morning that ended without warning. That detail matters, not because it makes the story more dramatic, but because it tells you something uncomfortable about where modern warfare has arrived. Distance used to mean safety. Being far inland used to mean you had time to react, time to defend, time to at least understand what was happening to you before it happened. That kind of time is disappearing. When missiles can travel hundreds of kilometers in a matter of minutes, when they arrive faster than sound, when defense systems cannot physically reach the altitude those missiles fly at, the old comfort of distance quietly stops applying. For generations, military planning assumed a simple rule. The deeper you build your bases inland, the safer they are. That rule shaped where countries built their airfields, their command centers, their supply depots. It shaped entire national defense budgets, funneling money toward long, thin borders instead of deep, layered protection further inland, because nobody expected an inland target to need the same level of defense as a coastal one. The single morning quietly broke that rule. Distance still matters, but it no longer guarantees the kind of safety it used to. And once a rule like that breaks in public, in front of cameras and satellites and journalists, every country holding on to the same old assumption has to go back and check whether their own version of that rule still holds. This was never really a story about one strike on one compound. It was a demonstration, a message written not in words but in physics, aimed at anyone paying attention. It said, clearly and without ambiguity, that mobile launch pads at sea can reach deep inland with a level of precision and coordination that most existing air defense networks are simply not built to stop. And the ripple effects of a message like that spread far beyond the two countries directly involved. Every nation that has spent the last 2 decades investing heavily in coastal air defense systems, betting that those systems would be enough to deter or defeat an attack from the sea, has to look at a morning like this one and ask hard questions. Are our interceptors fast enough? Can they climb high enough? Do we have enough of them to handle more than a handful of targets arriving at exactly the same moment? Is our chain of command fast enough to make decisions in seconds instead of minutes? For many countries, the honest answer to at least one of those questions is no. That uncomfortable truth does not stay contained to one region or one conflict. It becomes a factor in budget meetings in capital cities that have nothing to do with this stretch of ocean. It becomes a talking point in defense conferences held far away from any battlefield. It becomes, quietly, one more reason why global military spending keeps climbing every single year, because nobody wants to be the country that discovers its own gap in coverage the hard way in front of the entire world. Consider how differently this news lands depending on where you sit. A small nation with a modest coastline and an aging air defense network watches this and feels a knot form in its stomach, because it knows its own systems were bought decades ago, designed for a slower, simpler kind of threat. A larger power with deep pockets and advanced research programs watches the same footage and starts asking a different question. Not whether they are vulnerable, but how quickly they could build or acquire the same kind of coordinated strike capability for themselves. Both reactions point toward the same outcome. More spending, more research, more urgency around a problem that, until this morning, sat quietly on the back burner of most defense agencies. For the country that absorbed this strike, the choices left on the table were narrow and none of them were comfortable. It could try to build a deeper, faster, more coordinated air defense network capable of matching this kind of coordinated attack. That is expensive. It takes years. And even then, there is no guarantee it closes the gap completely, because the side doing the attacking can simply adjust its tactics again once it studies what worked and what did not. It could try to negotiate a different kind of relationship with its rivals, trading ambiguity and provocation for a more predictable, less volatile standoff. That is politically difficult, especially for leadership that has built its identity around defiance rather than compromise. Or it could accept, quietly and privately, even if not publicly, that the balance of power along that coastline had shifted, and that further attacks using the old playbook would now carry a far higher cost than before. None of those options feel good. All of them require admitting, at least internally, that yesterday's strategy does not survive contact with today's technology. There is a fourth path, too, quieter than the other three, and in many ways more likely than any of them. That path is simply waiting, absorbing the loss publicly while working behind closed doors to close the gap just enough to make the next attempt more costly without ever admitting defeat out loud. Nations rarely announce that their strategy has failed. They adjust quietly, reposition their forces, invest in new systems, and let time and selective silence do the work of rewriting the story for their own public. That is often how militaries actually respond to a shock like this one, not with a dramatic policy reversal announced on television, but with a slow, deliberate shift in priorities that only becomes visible years later, when someone finally looks back and connects the dots. What makes this story genuinely worth sitting with is not just who won or who lost on one particular morning. It is the pattern underneath it. Warfare has always rewarded whoever adapts fastest, not necessarily whoever has the flashiest weapons. The side that spent years studying its own mistakes, refining timing, refining coordination, refining the boring, unglamorous parts of military planning that never make it into recruitment posters, is the side that walked away from this exchange, having changed the entire equation. The side that leaned on distance, ambiguity, and hit-and-run tactics discovered in a matter of minutes that all three of those advantages had quietly expired. If this kind of deep, honest breakdown of what really happens behind the headlines is something you want more of, make sure you are subscribed. Because this channel is only going to keep digging into the stories that explain not just what happened, but why it happened, and what it means for everyone watching from the outside. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we close this out, and it has nothing to do with missiles or radar systems. It has to do with how fast the story of a morning like this spreads. And once it happens, word travels differently now than it did even 10 years ago. Sailors on nearby merchant vessels filming from the deck of their own ships, local residents posting what they saw and heard within minutes, news networks picking up footage before official statements are even drafted. In earlier decades, a strike like this might have stayed murky for days, wrapped in denial and counterclaims from every side. Now, the visual evidence often arrives before the ink dries on the first press release. That changes the calculation for everyone involved. It becomes much harder to hide behind ambiguity when there is video evidence circulating within the hour. That transparency cuts in every direction. It makes it harder for an attacker to quietly deny involvement. It also makes it harder for a defender to downplay just how badly things went. Everyone ends up negotiating and posturing in front of an audience that already knows most of the basic facts, which strips away a layer of political maneuvering room that used to exist in the fog of earlier conflicts. It also changes how ordinary people experience a conflict happening thousands of miles away. A generation ago, an event like this would have reached most viewers as a paragraph in a newspaper, days later, filtered through official statements and cautious language designed to avoid saying too much. Today it arrives as raw footage, shaky and real, often before either government has said a single official word. That shift changes the emotional weight of these stories. It is one thing to read that a strike happened somewhere far away. It is another thing entirely to watch the actual sky light up on a stranger's phone camera, time-stamped and unedited, while the world is still trying to figure out what it just witnessed. So where does that leave things, once the smoke has cleared and the immediate shock has faded? It leaves a coastline that assumed distance was armor, discovering that armor had quietly worn thin. It leaves a fleet offshore that proved patience and preparation can outweigh raw numbers, that a handful of ships, if used with enough precision and coordination, can accomplish what once might have taken a much larger and much more visible force. It leaves defense planners around the world rewriting slides and budget proposals because the lesson of this single morning will not stay confined to one region for long. Lessons like this one travel fast, and every serious military on Earth is already studying exactly what happened, second by second, to understand how it might be used against them or how it might be copied by them in some future conflict of their own. It also leaves behind a quieter kind of lesson, one that has less to do with missiles and more to do with mindset. The side that won this exchange did not win because it was louder, angrier, or more aggressive in the months leading up to it. It won because it was patient enough to study its own weaknesses honestly, disciplined enough to fix them slowly and methodically, and organized enough to make sure that when the moment finally came, every piece of the plan clicked into place without needing a single improvised decision. Under pressure. That kind of preparation rarely makes headlines while it is happening. Nobody writes exciting news stories about officers reviewing timing charts in a quiet planning room. But those quiet, unglamorous hours are exactly what decided the outcome of this very loud, very public morning. And it leaves a simple, uncomfortable truth hanging over everyone who thought that geography alone could keep them safe. The map has not changed. The coastlines are still where they always were. The mountains still stand exactly where they stood the day before. But the meaning of distance, the actual protection it once offered, has quietly and permanently shifted. What used to feel like safety now simply feels like time borrowed, not time guaranteed. That is the real story behind this morning. Not just steel and fire and shattered concrete, but a lesson written into the sky in contrails and silence. A lesson that says the old rules of who is safe and who is exposed no longer apply the way they used to. Every nation watching from the sidelines just received a preview of what a fast, coordinated, patient adversary can do when it stops improvising and starts planning years in advance. Nobody in that compound heard the missile that ended their morning. Nobody along that coast got the extra seconds they needed to change the outcome, and nobody watching from outside can honestly say anymore that distance, mountains, or old defense systems are enough to guarantee safety in a world where warfare moves this fast and arrives this quietly. Every conflict leaves behind two kinds of history. There's the version written in official reports, full of technical terms and careful language, meant for archives that most people will never read. And there is the version that lives in the memory of everyone who watched it unfold in real time on their screens, in shaky video clips, shared and reshared within minutes. This morning will live in both. But it is the second version, the human version, the one built from silence, shock, and a sky that changed everything before anyone understood what was happening. That will actually shape how people think about safety and distance for years to come. That is the real lesson of this strike, and it is one that will outlast the smoke, the headlines, and the news cycle by years. The world just watched the rules change in real time. And there's no going back to the old map now that everyone has seen what the new one looks like. If the story pulled you in the way it pulled me in while researching it, do one simple thing before you go. Like this video so it reaches more people who need to understand how fast modern conflict actually moves. Subscribe so you never miss the next breakdown. And leave a comment telling me what you think happens next in this region, because this story is far from finished and I want to hear where you think it goes from here.